The staff wore red vests and bow ties. There was soap for sale, and there was a queue that went around the block. This is how the first sex shop in Eastern Europe opened, in central Budapest, in the spring of 1990. An Austrian-Hungarian joint venture. The Austrian co-owner, a man named Wilhelm Sassmann, who had a philosophy he was willing to articulate for the press. He believed in the connection between healthy sex and a healthy body. He said the shop was cooperating with the Hungarian Ministry of Health on AIDS prevention. He had thought about the pricing, 100 forints for 30 minutes in one of the 19 video booths, compared to 70 Austrian shillings for the same time in Vienna, and had set it at a level proportionate to Hungarian purchasing power. He had hired staff and put them in red vests and bow ties because someone had decided that was the right aesthetic for this particular threshold moment in the sexual life of a nation. He had ordered soap because Sassmann believed in healthy bodies and soap is part of a healthy body. And on the day the shop opened, people came. I read about this in a Latvian newspaper that a colleague had left on the train between Leningrad and Moscow. Latvians were getting their news from different places by 1990, printing different kinds of stories, noticing corners of the world that the Soviet press had previously considered below its notice or outside its mandate. The story had come from a Budapest paper, been translated, reprinted, offered to Latvian readers as what it was, a historic event. The first sex shop in Eastern Europe, a record being set or a record being ended, depending on which column you were counting in. The shop was called Intim Center. The queues on opening day were long. Crowds filled the 19 booths and examined the merchandise, inflatable dolls, various devices, Western magazines, the soap, with what the Budapest correspondent described as unconcealed interest. A popular daily called the opening a historic event in the sexual life of Hungarians, and this was not, or not entirely, irony. After 40 years of a system that had regarded this entire category of human experience as either non-existent or ideologically suspect, the presence of a shop that sold items related to it was, in a specific and irreducible sense, historic. The people in the queue were not there only for the merchandise. They were there because a door had opened and they wanted to be among the first to confirm, with their own bodies present in the space, that the room on the other side was actually there. A young woman standing at the counter told the journalist, "Whether people agree with this or not, the human race is interested in these things. The queues prove it." She was right, and her rightness has the quality of all obvious truths. It is so clear that its clarity is itself a kind of accusation, directed at everyone who spent 50 years pretending otherwise. The journalist had spoken to one other person in the queue, whose words made it into the piece, though only briefly and in a different register. A woman further back in the line, older than most of the others, had been asked what had brought her there. She said she had stood in queues her whole life for bread, for sugar, for shoes, for permission to travel, for a telephone line, for a place in a kindergarten for her children. This was the first queue she had ever stood in for something like this, and she did not know what to call the feeling. It was not exactly curiosity, and not exactly approval, and not exactly shame. She said it quietly, the journalist noted, as though she were describing a word she had not yet been given. Then she shrugged and stayed in line. The article ended with a note that I have turned over many times since I first read it in that train compartment. In the West, it said, sex shops are closing one after another from lack of profit. The novelty had worn off in the countries that had arrived at this point earlier. The item had become ordinary, available, unremarkable, a shop like other shops, serving a market that was neither expanding dramatically nor producing the queues that the Budapest opening had generated. The queue in Budapest, in other words, was a queue of people standing in line for something that had already stopped being interesting in the place it came from. I held the Latvian paper and looked out the train window at the Soviet landscape passing, the birch trees, the long empty stretches, the collective farm buildings visible at a distance against the flat horizon. And I thought about the topology of that queue. People pressing forward to reach something that, on the other side of the continent, people had stopped pressing forward for a liberation and an anticlimax occupying the same object, simultaneously just in different cities. The excitement was real. The thing being excited about was already elsewhere, mundane. These two things were both true at once, and the train moved through the birch trees, and I folded the paper and put it in my bag. A few weeks later, I met Paul Hofheinz. He was 24 years old, and he had been in Moscow for nearly 2 years, working as the correspondent for Time magazine. The American news magazines were well represented in Moscow by 1990. The story was big enough and complicated enough that they had sent serious people who were willing to learn the language and stay long enough to understand what they were seeing. Hofheinz was one of these. He had good Russian. He had the particular quality of attention that comes from someone who decided early in their time here that understanding the place was more valuable than confirming what they already thought about it. We spoke first at a press event, one of the briefings that the Foreign Ministry was holding with increasing frequency in those months, trying to manage the narrative of an opening that was happening faster than anyone had planned for. We continued afterward at a cafe near the Arbat, where the tea was reliably too hot and took 15 minutes to become drinkable, and most of the good conversations I had in that cafe happened in the first 5 minutes before anyone had touched their cup. He told me, early in the conversation, about a colleague of his who had developed a toothache. Not a minor one, a serious toothache, the kind that escalates, the kind that requires actual intervention with actual equipment. The colleague had called the local clinic. The clinic had confirmed what everyone in Moscow with any experience of the healthcare system already knew. No disposable syringes, no disposable drills. The equipment that existed was shared and sterilized, or supposed to be sterilized, with the degree of reliability that everything in that system was sterilized. The colleague had thought about this for a day. He had thought about what shared dental equipment meant in 1990, in a city where the epidemic was small but present, where the blood supply was compromised in ways that the authorities were not yet fully acknowledging, where the assurance that sterilization had been properly performed meant exactly as much as any other assurance in any other Soviet institution. He had then bought a plane ticket to Helsinki. How Helsinki to Moscow is roughly 900 kilometers. A flight, a dentist, a local anesthetic, a drill, a filling, another flight. The colleague came back with a repaired tooth and the knowledge that his repair had been performed with equipment that had not been inside someone else's mouth the previous hour. Hofheinz told me this without special drama, as an example. The example he was giving was not of a good dental system in Finland versus a poor one in Moscow. The example was smaller and more precise than that. He said, the average Soviet citizen will not fly to Helsinki for dental work. He meant the option that was available to his colleague, the dollar savings account, the travel document, the connection to an institution that could grant a visa quickly, was not the option available to most people who had a toothache and a dental appointment at a clinic with no disposable drills. Those people made a different calculation and sat in a different chair. He was pointing at the gap between the two calculations, which was also the gap between the two outcomes, which was a gap that people in the second category were not in a position to close. I did not tell him, though I thought it, that I had sat in the second kind of chair 4 months earlier. I had had a molar that needed attention. I had gone to the district clinic where I had always gone, where a woman of about 60 in a white coat had been treating my teeth for nearly a decade, and I had sat in the chair and waited while she prepared her equipment. I had thought, while I waited, about what the equipment had done the previous hour, and about the autoclave in the corner that may or may not have been running at the temperature the manual specified. And then I had done what I was there to do, because I was not going to Helsinki, because I did not have the dollars and did not have the visa and did not have the kind of institutional connection that could produce either on short notice. She had done her work, and I had gone home. The tooth had been repaired. I did not know, and I still do not know, what else may have happened in those 15 minutes. That was the calculation Hofheinz was describing, which I had already made, which most of the people I knew had already made, which was the calculation the epidemic was built to find. We talked about what was happening on the Arbat. I had walked down it that same morning, as I walked down it most mornings, and the kiosks had been busy in the way they had been busy for the past 18 months, a density of merchandise that would have been impossible to find in any form 2 years earlier, including a substantial quantity of printed material of an erotic character that had appeared as though it had been waiting behind a door that someone had finally opened. Hofheinz said that he had never, in any American city he had been in, seen erotic material available for purchase, as openly and in such quantity as he had seen it on the Arbat. He said this as observation, not judgment. I asked him what he thought about it. The sexual opening that was happening alongside and mixed up with all the other openings, the political and economic and cultural openings of Glasnost and its aftermath. He said America's sexual revolution had come from a different direction entirely. Not from a lifting of censorship, not from a sudden official permission to discuss what had previously been forbidden. It had come, in his understanding, from the arrival of effective contraceptives, from the pill which had appeared in the early 1960s and had, by separating sexual activity from its reproductive consequences, changed the calculation most fundamentally for women. The revolution had been, at its core, a revolution in risk management. Sex became something that did not necessarily carry the consequence of pregnancy in every instance, and this changed what people could decide about it. And those decisions accumulated into something that looked, from the outside, like a revolution in attitudes when it was actually, at its structural base, a revolution in risk. The attitudes followed the changed arithmetic. What had arrived in Moscow, he said, was different. Not a changed arithmetic, but a lifted prohibition. The material had been suppressed and was now unsuppressed, all at once, without the years of negotiation and adaptation, and the development of the infrastructure, medical, educational, cultural, that might have accompanied a more gradual change. The Arbet erotica had arrived in the same season as cooperative businesses, as contested elections, as a dozen other things that had been forbidden and were now permitted. Everything at once, without the time that the other countries had taken, however imperfectly, to think about what the new freedoms meant in practice. He paused. Outside the cafe window, the Arbet was doing what it did in the evenings, people moving in both directions. The kiosks still open, the portrait painters competing with the postcard vendors, the new city assembling itself from the pieces of the old one in real time. He looked at it through the glass for a moment. Then he said, "In America, it is no longer an abstraction." He said it quietly. "Two friends," he said. Not friends of friends, not acquaintances, not professional contacts. Friends. People he had known. The first was 27 years old. The second was 31. He said their names. Not so I could write them down. There was no notebook open between us. This was a conversation, not an interview. He said their names the way you say them when you're checking that they are still real, that the fact of their having existed can still be retrieved. He looked at me. He said, "For you, it soon won't be an abstraction either." He did not say it as a warning or a reproach or as an attempt to make an impression. He said it as a statement from someone who had already passed through the part of the story where it stops being abstract. He was describing a trajectory that he had already traveled and that, by his estimation, we were going to travel. The question was not whether. The question was the distance between where we were and where he had been when it stopped being abstract. I thought about the queue in Budapest, the people pressing forward, the red vests and bow ties, the soap next to the inflatable dolls, because Sassman believed in the connection between healthy sex and a healthy body. The young woman at the counter. The cues prove it. She was right. The human race is interested in these things, and the decades of suppression had not changed that interest. And the lifting of the suppression had produced exactly what lifts of suppression produce, people coming through the door as fast as they can to reach the room that had been locked. And I thought about the names Hofheinz had said, 27 and 31. The names were in that room too, on the other side of the opening, past where the queue was standing. The shop in Budapest cooperated with the Ministry of Health on AIDS prevention. This was not cynical, the presence of accurate information about transmission, the availability of protective supplies, the normalization of frank discussion about bodies and risk. These things reduce harm. The evidence on this is unambiguous. Sassman was not wrong to say it. And at the same time, in cities where the doors had been open longer, 27 and 31. This is not a moral about what openness produces. Openness does not produce disease. Suppression produces the conditions in which disease spreads most efficiently by driving the risk underground where it cannot be tracked or addressed. The epidemic does not punish freedom. It punishes ignorance and the absence of the infrastructure that could convert knowledge into protection. All of this is true and important, and I want to be precise about it. And at the same time, Hofheinz was 24 years old, and had already watched two friends die. And he was telling a Soviet journalist in a cafe near the Arbat that the abstraction was going to become specific, because it had already become specific in the places that the curve had reached before us. And the curve did not slow down at borders or ideological differences or the distance between a Budapest shop with red vests and a Moscow street corner with erotica, and a dental clinic with shared drills. I walked home along the Arbat that night. The kiosks were still open. I passed through the merchandise of the new era, the photographs, the printed matter, the things that had been forbidden and were now available, and I thought about two men who were 27 and 31 and had names, and about a queue in Budapest where people were pressing forward into something that in Vienna was already ordinary, and about what the distance between those two facts meant for what was coming. Hedge, Hofheinz said at once, quietly, and it was enough. For you, soon, it won't be an abstraction either. He was right. He knew the shape of the story because he had already been in the later chapters of it, the chapters that we had not yet reached. The queue was real. The names were real. The queue was now. The names were what came after now. The tape runs to the end of its reel. The city outside is learning to be something it has never been before. New merchandise, new freedoms, new vocabulary for new arrangements. The old prohibitions dissolving one by one. Somewhere tonight there is a queue. Somewhere tonight there are names being said quietly by someone who is checking that they are still real. I put down the Latvian paper. I had read it on the train, and I had known, reading it, that the queue in Budapest was not only a queue, it was also a measure of the distance between where we were and where the names were. The distance was closing. Hofheinz had told me so, and he had already been there. And the bow ties and the red vests and the soap were the first marker on the road, and the names were the last, and the road between them was already being traveled whether anyone in the queue had looked up from the merchandise long enough to see where they were going. There is something I have been circling around in this account and want to say directly. The queue and the names are not in opposition. I want to be precise about this, because the way I have been telling this story might suggest that the shop in Budapest, the opening, the merchandise, the freedom arriving in red vests, is implicated in the names that Hofheinz said quietly in the cafe. It is not, or not in the way that implication usually works. The names were produced by a disease that spreads most efficiently through concealment, through the absence of frank discussion, through the conditions that stigma creates when it drives people away from information and medical care, and the ability to say clearly to another person what they need to know. The shop in Budapest, the Arbat merchandise, the curriculum decisions in Swedish schools, these were movements in the opposite direction. Toward visibility, toward frank discussion, toward the conditions in which accurate information can travel and protective choices can be made. Sassman was not wrong to say the shop cooperated on AIDS prevention. That kind of cooperation, that kind of normalization, that kind of making visible is how the transmission rate comes down. What Hofheinz was telling me, I think, was something more specific than a warning. He was telling me about the gap between where the information was and where the infrastructure was. America had had the information, the frank discussion, the explicit safer sex campaigns, the community organizations that were producing and distributing materials that the Soviet Union was not yet producing and distributing, and the names still existed. Because the gap between having information and having a functioning healthcare system that could respond to the illness, and a social environment that did not drive infected people into silence, and a legal framework that protected rather than punished, that gap had also cost time, had also cost names. The information had arrived before the infrastructure could fully use it. In Moscow in 1990, we were closer to the beginning of both gaps. The information was just arriving. The infrastructure, disposable syringes, reliable blood screening, anonymous testing facilities, the social conditions in which someone could say to a doctor what had put them at risk without fear of what the doctor would do with that information, was further away than most people who were paying attention wanted to admit. Hofheinz had been paying attention, which is what he was paid to do, and he had been doing it from a vantage point that allowed him to see further along the curve than most people I spoke to in those months. His two friends had died in a city that had, by any reasonable measure, a more functional response to the epidemic than Moscow did. He was not predicting that Moscow's experience would be identical. He was saying that the distance between where we were and where the names were was not as great as the official case counts suggested. The case counts were small because the system had not yet developed the capacity. Testing infrastructure, reporting systems, the basic medical visibility to know what the case counts actually were. I finished the tea, which had finally cooled enough to drink. Hofheinz finished his. We parted outside the cafe, and he walked in the direction of his bureau, and I walked in the direction of my apartment, along the Arbat, through the new merchandise of the new era. A thing I noticed, walking, the erotic postcards and the photographs were displayed openly, visible from the street, purchasable without effort or concealment or any of the elaborate arrangements that had previously been required to obtain them. This was, in the narrow sense, an improvement on the previous situation. Visibility is generally preferable to concealment. The frank acknowledgement that bodies exist and do things is generally preferable to the pretense that they do not. I believe this, and also there was no condom visible on any of those kiosks that evening. There was a great deal of material related to sex, and there was very little material related to preventing the transmission of what sex could transmit. The infrastructure lagged behind the opening, as it tends to. The queue was there. The protective supplies that the queue's members might have needed were somewhere else, in a medical system that was not yet organized to produce or distribute them at scale, behind a counter that was not on the Arbat. I went looking a day or two later for that counter. I stopped at 2 pharmacies in my district. The first had none. The pharmacist, a woman in her 50s, did not seem surprised by the question and did not seem surprised by her answer either. She said they had not received a delivery for some weeks. She did not know when the next one would come. She said it with the shrug that the system had taught people to shrug when they were asked about things. The system had decided not to organize reliably. The second pharmacy had a small box of what had been supplied the previous month. The pharmacist there handed me 3 without ceremony and marked something on a sheet she kept under the counter. The packaging was cheap. The seal was uncertain. The date stamp was a smudged approximation. I put them in my coat pocket and walked out. This was the apparatus on the other side of the opening. This was the infrastructure that the queue would have needed if the opening were to mean something beyond access to erotic material. It existed. It was not adequate to what had been unlocked on the street, and anyone who did the arithmetic honestly could see that it was not. This is the specific gap that Hofheinz was pointing at. Not freedom versus safety, which is a false opposition. The gap between the lifting of a prohibition and the building of what people need to navigate the thing the prohibition had been suppressing. The Soviet system had suppressed not only the discussion of sex, but the entire medical and educational and cultural apparatus that the discussion, conducted honestly and at scale, would have needed to be useful. Everything came down at once. The apparatus was not yet there to meet it. He knew 2 names, 27 and 31. In a city with a better apparatus, the names still existed, because the apparatus had not been built fast enough there either. He was not saying Moscow would avoid the names. He was saying Moscow would arrive at them by a different road, from a different starting point, and the distance was shorter than it appeared from inside the statistics. I wrote none of this down that evening. I walked home, and I put my coat on the chair, and I sat at the desk, and I turned on the tape recorder, and I said, "The queue is real, and the names are real, and the distance between them is the distance we are traveling." Then I turned the recorder off, because I did not know what came next. I still do not know. I know what has already happened in the cities that were ahead of us on the curve, and I know what Hofheinz told me, and I know that the bow ties and the red vests and the soap were the beginning of something, and that the beginning is not the hardest part of the journey. The tape runs. The queue is still there in my memory, long and patient, pressing toward the open door. The names are still there too. Both things, at once, in 1990, in the same spring, in the same world.